I hope the United States will keep out of this war. I believe that it will. And I give you assurance and reassurance that every effort of your government will be directed toward that end.
As war broke out in Europe in 1939, President Roosevelt's private thoughts did not mirror his public pronouncements. Convinced the U.S. would eventually enter another world war, he decided to run for an unprecedented third term as president. His skills forged by the political fires of the Great Depression and the New Deal, Roosevelt believed he could best steer the ship of state in a time of immense crisis.
We look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want. The fourth is freedom from fear.
Roosevelt knew that the Second World War would be a massive, do-or-die conflict between the forces of totalitarianism and democracy. Dr. New Deal would have to become Dr. Win the War.
When Hitler came to power in January of 1933, he blamed all of Germany's ills on 3 things. He blamed it on the Versailles Treaty, he blamed it on the communists, and he blamed it on the Jews. And he set out to destroy all 3. Now, that meant he wanted war, because only through war could you remake the map of Europe and could you eradicate entire political and religious groups. He built the finest army in the world. He built the finest air force in the world. He reoccupied the Rhineland. He forced the annexation of Austria and brought it into Germany.
Then, in 1938, Hitler demanded that Germany be allowed to annex a part of Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, fearing another world war, convinced the Czechs to give in. It was a catastrophic miscalculation.
I believe it is peace in our time.
Britain had given in at Munich in order to try and prevent war, and they had failed. And so after Munich and after Hitler took over the rest of Czechoslovakia, Britain came to the conclusion, we have done everything we could, now we are going to have to fight. The war officially began Friday, September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. As a result of the German invasion, Britain and France then declared war on Germany. The U.S. declared itself officially neutral.
The Germans innovated. They developed something called Blitzkrieg operational doctrine. They massed tanks, artillery, infantry in one division. They also added air power to this. They put it in a command structure, gave that guy the initiative, and then let it go. It worked brilliantly.
By the summer of 1940, Germany had conquered Poland, had conquered Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, and France. Britain was the only power standing in the way of total German control of Western and Central Europe.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its commonwealths last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself.
Roosevelt brings the United States to a position of all possible aid to Great Britain short of actually entering the war. November 1939, Congress passes cash and carry. Then September 1940, Roosevelt, with an executive agreement with Churchill, makes his destroyers for bases agreement. Then in March of 1941, Congress passes Lend-Lease. And so we incrementally move closer and closer.
He understood long before the American people did that the United States had to fight World War II. He would have gotten us there one way or another.
When England asks us to enter this war, she is considering her own future.
Not everyone agreed with Roosevelt's policies. Charles Lindbergh and many others, including members of Congress, were strong proponents of a more isolationist policy.
There are different groups of isolationists, different combinations that, for whatever reason, wanted to stay out of European affairs and did not see Germany as a direct threat. Because after all, the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, they're the two greatest anti-tank ditches in the world. And they felt that we could be protected by those things.
But with Britain on the ropes and Russia fighting for her very life, public sentiment shifted from isolationism toward helping the Allies. To this end, Roosevelt met publicly with Churchill to declare a common purpose.
The Atlantic Charter meeting was held off the coast of Canada in August of 1941. And I think there are three reasons or three factors behind it. First off, this would be the first time that President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill would be able to meet face-to-face since they became the leaders of their two countries. Second, both men bring their military staffs with them. Some very important military staff conversations took part at this meeting. Third, you have the U.S. and Britain issuing a joint statement of what they hoped the world would be like once the war was over, that it would be a world free from fear, free from want, free from aggression. And I think what Roosevelt hoped, this would be an emotional tie of the two countries that would bring us closer in step with Great Britain and that would help further to negate isolationist feelings.
By November 1941, the United States was on a virtual war footing. But with all eyes focused on Europe, it was an attack half a world away that sparked the flames of war.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Japan went to war against the United States because Japan wanted raw materials.
Japan is an island nation. It is a resource-poor nation. Even today, Japan depends on shipping. It depends on external resources for its oil, coal, and, iron ore, et cetera. All of those things that make a industrial power run.
But close by in Southeast Asia, you had British Malaya with huge deposits of tin and production of rubber. You had the Dutch East Indies with tremendous oil production. These were materials Japan wanted. Now that Europe was at war, Britain could not properly protect British Malaya. The Dutch could not protect the Dutch East Indies. There was only one policeman in that whole area that could possibly stop Japan from robbing the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya. That was the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor.
By October 1941, the Japanese leadership decided that war was going to come. It was inevitable with the U.S. And therefore, if it was going to come, Japan would have to choose the timing of its coming.
Now, as far as why we got caught by surprise, I think probably the key factor was, yes, we knew Japan was going to war. There was no doubt about that. But we thought their attack would come in the Southeast Asia area, because after all, that's where the raw materials were.
Tactically, it was a great success. They caught the battleships there and destroyed a number of them. Operationally, it was a failure because the decisive instrument for the conduct of naval warfare was not the battleship. The aircraft carrier is the dominant instrument for the conduct of naval warfare. Strategically, it was a failure also because one of the assumptions that the Japanese had was that Americans were weak, that Americans lacked the moral fiber to fight the Japanese. That was very wrong. As a matter of fact, nothing did more to unite the United States than the attack at Pearl Harbor.
I ask that the Congress declare a state of war between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
In the wake of Pearl Harbor, the United States declared war on Japan. Germany, Japan's ally, consequently declared war on the U.S. Almost immediately, some American troops were flung into action.
We shipped out of Honolulu on the 1st of December of 1941. And when we got word that Pearl Harbor had been hit, the whole convoy was diverted to Brisbane, Australia. So we were the first U.S. troops on foreign soil as from the outbreak of the war. The battalion was sent to Java to fulfill the commitment that FDR had made to help the Dutch defend the Dutch East Indies. The Japanese were invading the 1st of March. Within 7 days, where the Dutch decided to capitulate, and on March 8th, why capitulation orders came down to surrender to the Japanese. That was when the war ended for us. We went up to Burma to work on a railroad to link Thailand to Burma. They used 61,000 Allied prisoners. I weighed probably at least 100 pounds when I left Batavia in September of 42, and in May of 43, I weighed 60 pounds. Being a prisoner of war is like being thrown into the biggest human lottery in the world. You don't know what's going to happen in the draw. And that's the way I looked at it. You just got lucky in the draw.
All persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien, will be evacuated from the above area by 12 o'clock noon, Saturday, May 9th, 1942.
While some Americans were held prisoner by Japan, many Japanese Americans were held prisoner at home in the United States.
After Pearl Harbor, there was obviously a great shock in this country, and there was genuine fear on the West Coast that the Japanese might possibly invade. There was hysteria and panic, and when you combine that with the long history of anti-Japanese sentiment, you ignited this firestorm of hostility toward people of Japanese ancestry.
We could only take what we could carry, and most of us were carrying 2 suitcases or duffel bags.
They were tagged with a number, basically treated like luggage, put on a bus or a train and sent to what was called an assembly center. They were almost always at racetracks or old county fairgrounds. So many people remember finding that their new home was in fact a hastily converted horse stall. People were then transported to the more permanent War Relocation Authority centers. And there were 10 of those, and they were almost always in desolate and remote locations.
Nearly 100,000 Japanese Americans were confined during World War II in conditions that can at best be termed inadequate, and at worst, cruel and destructive. Ironically, Japanese Americans served with great distinction in the armed forces. One combat team became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for its size and length of service. The unit received over 18,000 individual decorations for bravery, 9,500 Purple Hearts, 7 Presidential Unit citations, and 20 Congressional Medals of Honor.
But there were a lot of Japanese Americans who had deep wounds, deep psychological wounds that had been caused by the camps. The sense of shame, this fear of being associated with the Japanese heritage. And there were a lot of people who thought the safest thing to do was to simply blend in. You know, not have ties with anyone of Japanese ancestry, never speak the Japanese language, you know, never try to teach your children anything about Japan. You have to understand many of them were adolescents or children, and so they could never quite cope with what had happened to them in terms of what it meant to be an American and what it meant to be of Japanese ancestry.
He was a famous trumpet man from out Chicago way. He had a boogie style that no one else could play. He was the top man at his craft. But then his number came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a blowing reveille.
Well, the first and most dramatic thing to be said about mobilization is that it ended the Depression. The unemployment rate goes virtually overnight from 14-15% in 1941 to about 1%, which effectively is no unemployment at all. It takes the war, not all the policies of the New Deal, finally to overcome this great, deep, protracted economic crisis.
We shall send you in ever-increasing numbers, ships, planes, tanks, guns. That is our purpose and our pledge.
The second thing is that the United States effects what was then called, and has been known in the history books ever since, as this production miracle, that it produces war materiel on a scale of a quantity and a quality, for that matter, such as it was virtually unimaginable in warfare. 40 billion bullets, thousands upon thousands of long-range bomber aircraft, completely outfits and deploys 16 million men in the Army. Millions of tanks. These production numbers are just astronomical. The third characteristic of mobilization is that the United States is the only belligerent in World War II that managed not only to raise and equip a large-scale armed force and, in fact, in the process, heavily equip its allies, but at the same time to raise civilian standards of living at home.
The availability of good jobs shifted populations from south to north, east to west, as people followed jobs to new homes. One unusual aspect of the economic expansion was that it lifted everyone.
During the war, opportunities opened up in agriculture. Again, the vast number of men employed in agriculture, including the Latino population, left and joined the armed forces. But because of the great need for food to feed not only the American people, but the soldiers involved in the war, there was a tremendous need for labor. And that provided increased opportunities for people, primarily from Mexico, to find jobs in the United States. Because of the war effort and the manpower needs of the country, that opened up opportunities in defense industries. So jobs opened up for Latina females in the defense industries.
While minorities benefited from the economic boom, discrimination persisted. Pay scales were not always equal, and segregation and racial violence continued. For African Americans, the struggle to gain access to defense industry jobs was absorbed into a larger campaign that called for a double victory.
There was a feeling that you need to bring democracy at home as well as democracy abroad. You need to fight racism at home as well as fight against fascism abroad. So the notion of a double V campaign was something that encapsulated the goals of African Americans. It was initiated by the Pittsburgh Courier at the beginning of the war and became enormously popular as a way of unifying the black population to support the war, but to see the war as a means to making social gains at home.
As the result of a landmark negotiation with black labor leader A. Philip Randolph, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which ensured job access to African Americans.
In some communities, employers dislike to employ women. In others, they are reluctant to hire Negroes. We can no longer afford to indulge such prejudices or practices.
Rock-a-bye, my baby, there ain't gonna be no war. There ain't gonna be no war over here.
Women, too, flocked to the workplace to replace the 15 million men gone to the armed forces.
For me, defense work was the beginning of my emancipation as a woman. For the first time in my life, I found out that I could do something with my hands besides bake a pie.
Women got a taste of employment during the war. They liked the financial rewards. Some of them liked the opportunity to do something besides childcare and housework.
We're one for all and we're all for one. They'll get a licking before we're done. Millions of voices are ringing.
Morale was really pretty good during World War II. And one of the ways of coping, whether it be with the separation from husband, the increasing strain because of working all day and then having housework at night and on the weekends, I think they cope with that because they really felt that they were contributing to a war that was the right war, a necessary war.
But work did not make everything all right. The war was a time of tremendous disruption in family life. Couples were separated. Children did not receive as much attention. Every family sacrificed in some way.
On Saturdays, you would go around and pick up iron or any metal and bring it to a collection agency. I had two uncles that fought. Mother was very close to her brothers, and I know she worried very much about them, and was always tickled to death when we got a letter, you know, from one of them, and that they were okay.
My mother had 7 brothers, and 6 of them served in World War II. I remember my mother saying that there were shortages, many shortages during the war, and that people had to make do with what they had.
First couple of years of World War II, there were immense gardens that they put in, and the Bureau at Pine Ridge would just plow 40, 50 acres, and then people would go in and pick a plot, and then they'd all be growing vegetables. And it was, all of a sudden, you were solving some food problems. But church services, my father couldn't get enough gas to drive around and hold service. The war was really hard on him. The trauma of these caskets coming back, having to console the family, and he was football coach at Martin for 2 years. So, you know, here were kids that just a couple of years ago, he was teaching how to throw a football, and they're coming back dead now. So it gets, I think, very emotional for me to remember that.
The first foreign military attack on American territory since 1812. The most dramatic economic expansion in American history, and what some have called the single greatest assault on the Constitution. World War II resulted in enormous change on the American home front.
Socially, politically, economically, the United States was transformed. It was a technological revolution. You know, the microwave oven in your kitchen right now was developed during World War II. Search for submarines. You've heard of Rosie the Riveter. That transformed America. The men went off to war, the women went to the factories. When the war came to an end and the men came back home, the women went back into the kitchen. However, their daughters did not. There was a migration of blacks out of the South. My parents moved out of Arkansas. Some of them went to Chicago, where the industry was booming, and then others went to Berkeley. And in the Bay Area is where they were building those Liberty ships. And they used to brag how many ships they could turn out a day.
Ultimately, this migration would be important certainly in the post-war period, because many of those African Americans would remain and thus would become a very important political voting group within the northern and western cities.
It's during this period that African Americans become more integrated in American life, even as many of the aspects of segregation continue. World War II, as a mobilization of the entire society, brought many African Americans closer to the mainstream, even in terms of being in the military. Even as a segregated military, they were at least part of the same institution that was shaping the lives of so many Americans.
Something like 25,000 Indians fought in World War II, Indian people fighting for the United States government. And in the process of that, they changed attitudes. It changed the attitudes of Indian people, the federal government, of bureaucrats, throughout the entire world.
We have over 500,000 Latinos that participated in the war, whether they were Puerto Rican, whether they were Cuban, or whether they were Mexican. And they got a new sense of pride in being American. They were being treated as equals. If you were a soldier, you followed orders, and it didn't matter who you were. What mattered was that you became part of a unit to fight the enemy, and that you did everything in your power to make sure that you survived and you accomplished the mission.
I got pretty good at figuring shells. I could tell when a shell went way over our head and went down there, boom, way, a mile away. And then when one came real short from where I was and exploded, and I knew one was coming on my right, and I knew one was coming on my left. And when it was come right at me, I hit that ground and prayed like I never prayed before. And whoo, right close to me. I never could get used to it. It scared the heck out of me.
Going to war transformed the lives of young Americans of every race and creed. Their experience ranged from the depths of fear, loneliness, and loss to the heights of courage, adventure, and camaraderie.
We always looked after each other. You don't keep score. Nobody said, well, let's see, I took care of you for 3 days, you owe me 3 days. Doesn't work that way.
The generation who fought the war sustained a strength of commitment such that their own children would later look back and call them the greatest generation. As 1942 dawned, Hitler and Nazi Germany ruled Western Europe and threatened to overrun Russia. With the U.S. now in the war, the Allied challenge was to agree on a strategy to engage and defeat the Axis forces.
The fundamental strategy, I think, was to defeat Germany first, and then turn on Japan, or to defeat Japan. This is known as the Germany first strategy. That Roosevelt and Churchill, Stalin all agreed. I say basically that it was more important to defeat Germany because Germany was a stronger enemy.
Roosevelt pushed for unconditional surrender, and I think what Roosevelt was saying with this was that defeating the Axis militarily will not be enough. After all, in World War I, we had defeated the German army, and yet 20 years later, we're having to do it again. He was saying by unconditional surrender, we are going to end German and Japanese militarism and imperialism and to remake them into democracies. To come to victory, you have a number of elements of an overall grand strategy. You've got Russian manpower, you've got American industrial might, and a third key element was the Anglo-American control of the seas, so that that industrial might of the United States could reach not only our own troops, but to the troops of the Soviet Union and Great Britain across the oceans.
The Allies were in accord on the global war strategy, but their agreement broke down when it came to deciding on its implementation.
Soviet Union desperately was crying for help. Said, we need you to open a second front in Western Europe. We need you to invade France as soon as possible to lessen the strength of the German thrust against us. Great Britain argued instead that we should use 1943 to clear the Axis out of the Mediterranean, and we should have the opening of the second front, the cross-channel invasion then in 1944. Roosevelt ultimately made the decision that we would follow the British idea and said, we will postpone that European invasion until 1944.
Major U.S. involvement began in North Africa, challenging the German forces under General Rommel. The North African campaign got the U.S. into the war, but did little to relieve the pressure on the Soviet Union.
Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, and this was where the great struggle was. The vast bulk of the German army was tied down in the Soviet Union.
Stopped by winter and stiff Russian resistance in 1941, the Germans resumed the offensive in 1942. Their aim? To secure the oil fields of the Caucasus and lay siege to Stalingrad. By the fall, the Germans were on the outskirts of the city, but Stalingrad would not fall. For 3 months, the battle raged street by street, house by house, until the entire city was rubble. In December, the German commander begged Hitler to allow his weary army to retreat. After months of fighting, a starving, ill-supplied, and broken army finally surrendered to the Russians in early 1943. The effect on Allied morale was immediate.
Many people believe that Stalingrad is the turning point in the war. That's winter 42-43. Clearly by then, the outcome of the war on the Eastern Front has been decided. The Russians are now on the offensive and the Germans are on the defensive.
Capitalizing on the momentum, in the summer of 1943, the Americans and British invaded the underbelly of Europe through Italy, where many young American soldiers got their first taste of battle.
We hit a beach, ramp went down, and we rushed off. And that's the first German soldier I saw was killed. He was about 20 years old, a young boy, age of most of the fellas. He wearing a khaki uniform, short pants uniform of Africa Corps.
The Italian front proved valuable as it tied down considerable German troops and resources. It also supplied needed airfields as the air war, a massive effort in the war against Germany, gained momentum.
No other nations devoted the resources that Great Britain and the United States did to air power. This was an unproven form of war. Nobody had ever demonstrated that strategic air power could win a war. It is believed that in a complex industrial society, there are certain things that are a must. Electrical power plants, oil, the railway system. Right? There are certain things that if you knock those out, you paralyze the whole thing, right? And that's what they're searching for. They all concentrate on the destruction of the German aircraft industry. By the time you get to Normandy, oh boy, air superiority is just about won.
good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
June 6, 1944, D-Day. The long-awaited Second Front finally opened as British, American, French, and Canadian armies under the command of General Dwight Eisenhower landed on the beaches of Normandy. 2 years of planning and preparation came down to a single day.
Normandy invasion, I would argue, is the most important campaign of the war for the British and the Americans. Getting back on the continent is clearly the most important operation. Had it failed, Europe may not look the way it does now.
Just after dawn on the 6th, as planned, troops poured ashore at Juneau, Gold, Sword, and Utah beaches. But the landing on Omaha Beach was a different story.
Aircraft came in, missed the beaches, the bombs fell, 3-4 miles inland. When 0630 came and the 1st Infantry Division hit Omaha Beach there, nothing had been destroyed. The German defenses were intact. It was a very bloody day. And it was so bloody that at noon, Bradley was thinking about pulling off Omaha Beach. However, the Navy destroyers moved in as close as they could. The infantry guys on the beach got themselves together, and eventually they worked their way up that bluff. But it was extremely costly. We paid for every inch of that beach.
In July, the Allies broke out of Normandy and swept across France toward the German border. Tough fighting still loomed in Holland, Belgium, and Germany. But by January 1945, caught between the Russian armies advancing from the east and the American and British armies from the west, German resistance was crumbling. In February, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in Yalta to finalize their agreements on the shape of post-war Europe. Germany would be administered by all 4 Allied powers, each in their own zone of occupation. Roosevelt and Churchill conceded the Soviet Union's sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, while Stalin, in turn, committed to join the war against Japan after Germany was defeated. Yalta was destined to be the last meeting of the Big Three. In April 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died, even as British and American forces pushed across the Elbe River and Russian troops fought in the streets of Berlin. There, surrounded and under artillery fire, Adolf Hitler, Führer of the Thousand-Year Reich, committed suicide in his command bunker. His armies surrendered unconditionally 8 days later.
The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241 local time, May 7th, 1945. Eisenhower.
I argue that the Allies won strategically. Right? They sat down together in the same room. They developed a comprehensive strategy for the conduct of the war. Now, they argued about that strategy throughout the war, but the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese never did that. They fought 3 different wars, essentially, instead of sitting down coordinating their efforts. Was it possible for the Germans to win? Yeah.
Wenn die älteren Jahrgänge noch wanken werden könnten, die Jugend ist uns verschrieben und verfallen mit Leib und mit Seele.
First thing they came and they registered us. And I remembered when they registered us, everybody said, oh, what does it make any difference? You know, registration is nothing. And then they gave us a little time and they said, who's Jewish doesn't have to go to school. Then they decided to have us wear yellow stars. Wherever we went, we had to wear a yellow star on the left side.
What Hitler did was progressively deprive Jews of their rights as Germans. He kicked them out of the universities, he kicked them out of the civil service. He restricted their opportunities to walk on the street, to sit in the park, to shop.
But it was a single night in 1938 that set the tone for the nightmare to come.
Kristallnacht, the night of November 9th and 10th, 1938. The Germans came out and they broke the windows of Jewish stores and they destroyed property and they arrested 20,000 or 30,000 Jewish men.
119 synagogues were set fire, another 76 completely destroyed. 20,000 Jews were arrested, 36 deaths were reported, and so seriously injured were also numbered 36.
One morning they came and they had 2 cars. And one car, the police department was, and the other car, we had to go on there. And for 2 days, we traveled to a ghetto.
What Hitler wanted to do in the 1930s was to get the Jews out of Germany. Nobody wanted the Jews. I mean, each country took a few, but not the numbers that wanted to leave. Roosevelt didn't want to take a stand. Most of the country was anti-Semitic. And even after Kristallnacht, 10 days after Kristallnacht, Senator Borer got up in Congress and said, we should not change our immigration laws. And he got mail from all over the country applauding his stand. By 1941, Hitler realized nobody would take the Jews. The only way to get rid of them is to kill them.
They packed us into about 150 people in one train. And we were all standing up. You couldn't even lay down.
Slowly at first, then steadily faster, the awful grinding gears of deportation and extermination began to turn.
For 3 days and 3 nights, we were like that. No food, no water, no nothing was given to us. And no toilets. And the top of everything, one woman gave birth to triplings. 3 little boys.
In occupied Poland, screened from prying eyes, Hitler's henchmen built concentration camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and began the systematic execution of Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, and homosexuals that they called the final solution.
Sudden, I remember we arrived to Auschwitz. And when that door opened up, people started pushing. You can imagine fresh air. Everybody just pushed, and I got pushed out. And as I stood on that platform, suddenly with the corner of my eye, a little car, just like, I would describe it like a little ambulance. And in the back, they had all the corpses. Lots of people had died on the train. And they took this woman with the 3 babies, and they pushed it in the top of the corpses. And when they did that, in my mind, I thought there's something very evil going on here. I screamed so loud that my mother turned her head. And she had 1 baby on one side and 1 baby on the other side, my little brothers. And that's the last I ever saw of my mother. And I got on the working group, and she went in straight in the crematorium. I never will forget, the door was wide open, and they were going in like herds. I mean, they were rushing in. People were rushing in that place. It was a scene that it will never escape my eyes. The scene of how people rushed into that crematorium. They didn't know where they were going.
Faced with mounting evidence of the scope of Hitler's atrocity, Roosevelt looked for ways to help. But there was little political support at home, and the consensus of the Allies was against diverting the war effort from its primary purpose of defeating Germany.
I would have done exactly what Roosevelt did, and I'm Jewish. I too would have prioritized, and I too would have kept my eye on winning the war as quickly as possible. And in retrospect, that was the way to save most of the Jews.
When British and American troops finally liberated the first camps in 1945, the initial response was disbelief.
I pray you to believe what I have said about Buchenwald. I have reported what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most of it, I have no words.
We come to Dachau. We got in there, and on my left was a railroad siding, and they had boxcars. And some of the fellows that opened a door near the end of the train, we found bodies that were stacked like sardines. And we got closer, you could see, it's hard to tell a man from a woman. Just skin and bones. There's an experience that I remember to this day, I think about.
While the U.S. Army and Air Force dominated the fighting in Western Europe, the Navy and Marine Corps took the lead in the Pacific.
Coral Sea takes place in May of 1942. And that is the first aircraft carrier battle. The big battle, though, is Midway. Following June of 1942, the Japanese will lose 4 aircraft carriers. That's the turning point in the war in the Pacific. Right? From that point on, we are on the offensive, and the Japanese are on the defense.
The naval battles were followed by 2 years of fierce and bloody jungle fighting across islands with names now etched in Marine Corps history: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. This island-hopping campaign eventually provided a forward airfield to launch the air war against mainland Japan.
That was a very costly campaign initially, but ultimately they get a guy named Curtis LeMay in there. He's got these new munitions, napalm. In March 1945, firebombing of Japan starts. He puts over 300 bombers in the air, and they attack Tokyo. When that is over with, it will be roughly 100,000 dead. Something like 15 square miles of Tokyo will be burnt out.
Firebombing continued as Marines landed on Okinawa, the first island of the Japanese homeland, on April 1st, 1945. Unbelievably, the fighting intensified.
Okinawa was an important campaign in the sense that it made people think very hard about Operation Downfall. Operation Downfall was the plan for the invasion of Japan. Right? And high estimates were that that operation would cost 500,000 casualties.
Even as the United States pondered and planned the costly invasion of Japan, startling developments in New Mexico changed the options. The Manhattan Project was the code name for the development of the atomic bomb, a joint project between the United States and Britain, the most secret operation of the war. In July 1945, the first successful test was carried out.
Truman, on his way to Potsdam, got word of our first successful test of the atomic bomb. At Potsdam, he then informed Stalin that we had a new and very great weapon. Stalin told Truman, well, I hope you use it as soon as you can against Japan. Other than that, Stalin, to Truman's surprise, asked very few questions. Well, ironically, of course, because of Soviet spies within the atomic bomb project, I suspect that Stalin knew far more about the atomic bomb than poor Harry Truman did, who'd only been told about it a short while after Roosevelt's death. In August of 1945, Truman needed to bring Japan to a position where they would accept unconditional surrender. basically three options open to. One, we could invade and conquer Japan with the potential of just horrendous casualties. Second possibility was to blockade and starve the Japanese people into submission. Third possibility was the atomic bombs.
On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped the first atomic bomb over the city of Hiroshima. Initial casualties were estimated at 80,000 dead, 35,000 wounded. Many would die shortly after of radiation sickness. On August 8th, as promised at Yalta, the Russians entered the war against Japan. On August 9th, while the Japanese considered an American ultimatum to surrender, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the port city of Nagasaki. Surrounded by small mountains, the bomb's force concentrated to virtually destroy the entire city. Casualties ran into the hundreds of thousands.
There was no way at that time the Japanese were going to win it. And just to prolong it was to prolong the suffering and the sacrifices that people were making in Japan. I don't see how anyone can logically argue that the atomic bomb was not the best thing that happened, bringing the war immediately to an end.
But the U.S. decision to drop the only atomic bombs ever used in war is one that people still grapple with today.
Well, President Truman justifies his decision to drop the bomb on two cities by saying that that was the only choice he had. He had the bombs, and the bombs had been developed to use, and the war was still going on. The alternative to not using them would have been to invade the home islands of Japan. The casualties would have been just horrendous. Well, my personal view is that no matter how justifiable the first bomb may have been, and that's disputable, the second one coming right after the first would have been less justifiable, I think.
Of those three possibilities, invasion, starvation, atomic bombs, the atomic bombs presented the best option of getting Japan to accept unconditional surrender in the shortest period of time with the fewest casualties. I believe it was the correct decision.
In the wake of the atomic bombs, Japan proffered its unconditional surrender.
These proceedings are closed.
I look at war as a destructive force, but it's also a creative force. World War II destroyed Nazi Germany. It destroyed Imperial Japan. So in that sense, war is clearly a destructive force, but also a creative force. It created the world that we live in right now.
One thing you have to acknowledge is that the United States fought a war in World War II, unlike everybody else's. The Soviet Union alone lost 24 million people in World War II, of which 16 million were civilians. We lost 6 civilians. So if you ask who paid the greatest price for the victory in World War II, it's not the United States. It's the Soviet Union which paid the greatest price in both blood and treasure. If winning means what country is better off at the end of the war than at the beginning of the war, again, there's only one country that fills that definition. It's the United States. When the war ended in 1945, Winston Churchill gave a speech on the floor of Parliament. He said, "The United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world," in 1945. Now, that was emphatically true in 1945, and it's, with maybe some qualifiers, it's been true ever since.
The Charter of the United Nations, which you are now signing, is a solid structure upon which we can build for a better world.
The war made sure that we would now accept a position of world leadership. We had not wished to do that at the end of World War I. Now, despite latent isolationism that has always been part of the, I believe, part of the American characteristic, the American people realized they would have to take a position of leadership in the world, that there was really no choice.
If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace.